origin and development of bowing forms one of the most intriguing chapters in the whole history of musical instruments. Before the 11th century, there's no trace of bowing at all in Western Europe, yet a mere century later, bowing techniques are amazingly widespread. Now, considering that the bow itself was the generic type from which the harp, the lute, and the lyre had all developed in ancient times, it may seem surprising that it took so long for anyone to think of using the bow as a means of sounding the strings. But once tried, the idea caught on like wildfire and revolutionized both the making and the playing of stringed instruments. That almond, like the rest of Dowland's Lacrymae collection, was set forth for the lute, viols or violins in 5 parts. And by the time it was printed in 1604, the 2 principal families of bowed instruments were firmly established, the violins and the viols. Both were fairly recent developments of the Renaissance, and during the Middle Ages, things were rather different. To start with, there was no such thing as a specific type of bowed instrument. It was just a question of the application of the bow to existing pluck types, the lute, the lyre, and so on. The evolution of new forms expressly designed to be bowed was a much more gradual process. Initially, the use of the bow developed outside Europe, probably in Asia during the 9th century, and spread first to the empires of Islam and Byzantium. The earliest bows may actually have been a development of the plectrum. Many European illustrations show long plectra-like pencils or short rods, which could easily be used as friction sticks by scraping instead of plucking the strings. During the transitional period, the same plectrum was probably used to produce different sounds on the same instrument. With this one, it's possible to ring the changes on 3 different techniques: plucking, striking by using the plectrum like a drumstick, and even a kind of primitive bowing. From that stage, it was an easy step to equipping the stick with horsehair or some other suitable material in order to make the string resonate more effectively. And that's a pretty fair prototype of the sort of bowed instrument which became known as the rebec, from the Arab word rabab. Medieval pictures illustrate the same kind of changeover. In this 13th century Spanish manuscript, you can see the same sort of instruments first of all being plucked, and then, with a change of playing position, being bowed. Behind these early experiments with bowing, there seems to have been an underlying desire to find a stringed instrument which could match the human voice. According to a Baghdad scholar who lived in the 10th century, the instruments which most approach the human voice are the rabab and the wind instruments. Certainly the use of the bow gave stringed instruments a new sustaining power. Unlike the lute or psaltery, bowed instruments could vie with the human voice in flexibility of tone and phrasing. and as a Welsh folk instrument, the crwth perpetuated the tradition of the bowed lyre right through to the end of the 18th century. To start with, there seems to be little correlation between different names and different types of construction. Rubeb, rubible, rebec, geiger, lyra, fidula and viella were all applied by medieval writers somewhat indiscriminately to the new types of bowed instrument. But gradually, two distinct forms emerged. The smaller, pear-shaped type, usually known as the rebec, and the larger figure of eight or waisted shape, usually known as the fiddle. Unlike their Eastern counterparts, the new bowed instruments were amongst the most important in European court society. For the privileged classes, playing the fiddle was something to be practiced not for its usefulness, but for its own sake. Whole orchestras of fiddles were maintained at the court of Alfonso the Wise of Castile. Fiddlers accompanied their lords on journeys, playing on horseback as they rode. They were also part of the Queen's retinue. In the medieval German epic of Tristan, the knight spends his days in the hunting field with the king, and the evenings entertaining him with songs, accompanying himself on harp and fiddle. Besides being in demand for banquets, weddings, and other celebrations, from the 13th century onwards, fiddlers also found employment in church too. The 15th century theorist Tincturis actually recommends both the fiddle and the rebec for use in church music. But by the 16th century, the rebec had acquired a more secular reputation and became especially associated with the dance. Unlike the fiddle, which was made only in one size, roughly equivalent to the modern viola, the rebecs developed a complete treble to bass consort, although it was the small under-the-chin size which was by far the most common. I suppose the most extraordinary of the medieval bowed instruments was the tromba marina, since it uses only natural harmonics. The strings are stopped by touching very lightly with the fingers, whilst the bow is drawn between the left hand and the head of the instrument. The result is anything but angelic. It's easy enough to see where the name tromba came from, since the instrument is limited to the same natural series of harmonics as the trumpet, and is, if anything, even more strident. Marina, though, that's a bit more of a problem, since there's certainly no connection with the sea. One theory is that the name should really be Marian trumpet, that's to say, of the Virgin Mary, since artists so often depicted it in the hands of angels. Be that as it may, the main reason for the tromba marina's rather unlikely tone is the nature of the bridge. One end is fixed in position by the string, whilst the other barely touches the body. When bowed, it's this end of the bridge which vibrates against the body and produces quite a penetrating rattle. When we reach the Renaissance, the story of bowed instruments is dominated by two main families, the viols and the violins. Now, you often hear it said that the viol is some kind of ancestor of the violin, but this isn't so at all. In fact, both families appeared within a century of one another. They belong to the same rather than different generations of early music, whilst their technique, repertory, construction, and so on are all quite distinct. The viol developed in the 15th century in Spain, and its origins lie with this instrument. The vihuela is a Spanish flat-backed guitar with 5 or 6 strings. And the word viol comes from the same Latin root as vihuela. An early name for the viol was vihuela de arco, a vihuela played with the bow. This painting by Veronese clearly illustrates the transition from guitar to viol. The player, probably a self-portrait of Veronese incidentally, is holding the instrument guitar style across the knee, whilst the right hand desperately tries to find a comfortable method of bowing. It was inevitable, really, that the position of the instrument should change from the horizontal to the vertical, with the bottom end gripped by the knees. Hence the most common name for the viol, the vihuela or viola da gamba. consort of viols provided the perfect instrumental combination for Renaissance polyphony, sonorous, flexible, and sustained. No wonder there was such a wide repertory of fantasies and in nomines, especially written for viols. Of course, the viol did become especially associated with the aristocracy, and since one of the favourite aristocratic pastimes was horse riding, it can be seen that viol playing was a rather complementary activity, since both demand the same sitting position. By Shakespeare's time, the viol's aristocratic associations had become something of a standing joke. In Twelfth Night, Sir Andrew Aguecheek is said to play at the viol de Gamboys, and one of the most amusing references comes in Thomas Middleton's play A Trick to Catch the Old One, where there's much satire at the expense of a young girl about to be educated into the best society manners. A voice between her lips and the viol between her legs, she'll be fit for a consort very speedily. One of the most famous gentleman amateurs was the English eccentric Captain Tobias Hume, who was so fond of giving his pieces fanciful titles such as My Mistress Hath a Pretty Thing, Tickle Me Quickly, and Hit It in the Middle. Here's one of his duets for two bass viols. That's an example of what's meant by playing the lyre away, a rather specialised solo style which involved a lot of chordal playing and sometimes special tunings too. In Elizabethan times it must have seemed very unlikely that a mere violin would ever oust the noble family of viols from favour. Although standardised by about 1550, the violin was regarded as a low instrument, fit for nothing but taverns and dance music. If you just compare the violin and the treble viol for a moment, you can see how distinct the two families were. For a start, both the playing position and the bow grip are both quite different. Overhand for the violin, underhand for the treble viol, with the fingers actually gripping the horsehair. The viol retained the 6 strings, the frets, and the flat back of the guitar, whilst the violin had no frets, only 4 strings, and a round back. Both the rebec and the fiddle contributed to its design, and the violin drew great strength from its double parentage. The instrument, which emerged about the middle of the 16th century, had an outstanding potential for sonority, agility, and expressiveness. And as everyone knows, it had one of the most incredible success stories in the whole history of musical instruments. Within 50 years, it had conquered any initial doubts and prejudices. Within 100, it had invaded every sphere of musical life: court, church, chamber, and opera house. It had acquired an enviable and already prodigiously difficult solo repertoire. And as far as any kind of ensemble music was concerned, well, it had simply eclipsed all other instruments. The use of a string band like that in Monteverdi's Orfeo and other operas helped to lay the foundations of the modern string orchestra. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the artistry and craftsmanship of the early violin makers. And perhaps in a way theirs was the most remarkable achievement: to bring a new instrument to the peak of perfection in such a short space of time.